Well, Moses was sitting near the dumps in Egypt, and he was down in the dumps. He was feeling pretty bad because Pharaoh hadn't listened to him, and even the Israelites had given up on him as being the guy that was going to set them free. And all of their work had become harder, and Moses was just kind of down on himself and discouraged, and he was sitting there in the dumps, and this big voice came out of heaven. And it said, "Moses, I got some good news and some bad news." And Moses kind of said, "Okay, Lord." And God said, "This is the good news. I'm going to smite the Egyptians with poison water and with frogs and with bugs. I'm going to kill their livestock. I'm going to rain hail and fire down on them. And they're going to let you eventually go to freedom." And Moses says, "Well, that's good news. What's the bad news?" And God said, "Well, your part is to file the environmental impact statement." Okay, sorry. Fortunately, Moses and God didn't need an environmental impact statement. But what God did in the chapters of Exodus that we're going to look through today had a huge impact. Had a huge impact. And such an impact was needed because Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, wasn't willing to let hundreds of thousands of slaves go free. And God had to do something significant to persuade him to do that. And so God sent these plagues on Egypt. Here's what I think is the big idea of these chapters we're looking at today. There's only one true, all-powerful God. There's only one true, all-powerful God. And he is working out his perfect plan. He is working out his perfect plan. We've been studying the life of Moses, and I realized looking at my notes when I came back from vacation that this is week number 8. It amazes me that it's been that many weeks already, and we still have a long ways to go studying Moses. We'll be looking at his life most all summer. And he just has so many lessons to teach us. But when we last saw Moses, he was, as the silly joke said, down in the dumps. He was discouraged because he'd gone to Pharaoh, seemingly expecting Pharaoh just to say, "Sure, go ahead and go and worship your God, go free." And Pharaoh didn't do that. In fact, Pharaoh said, "I'm God. Who's your God? Who's this Yahweh you're talking about?" And because he insisted that they should go free, Pharaoh decided to make things harder on Moses and on the Israelites, and he increased their workload for them. And their masters started whipping them because they weren't able to meet their quota of making bricks. And things just got worse and worse for the Israelites because Moses was demanding their freedom. And so even the Israelites turned against Moses. And so he was down in the dumps and discouraged. And that's where we left the story, and that's where we pick it up today. In the midst of that discouragement, God goes to Moses, and he says, "Now go back to Pharaoh, and I will multiply my signs among them." Go back to Pharaoh. Can you imagine how that felt to Moses, feeling the way he was feeling? And God just says, "Okay, go back and do it again." And what follows is a series of 9 plagues that God was using to change Pharaoh's heart. Now, really, there are 10, but number 10 is such a special plague that we're going to consider it in its own sermon next week. And so we will look at that 10th one next week. But there were 9 plagues. And after each plague, Pharaoh tells Moses, "No, you can't go." Now, a number of times during the plague, Pharaoh seems to relent and says, "Okay, take the plague away and you can go." But once the plague is over, Pharaoh's heart was hardened and he wouldn't let the people go. And so God multiplies one sign after another, one plague after another on Pharaoh and the Egyptians. Let me tell you briefly the story that's in these 4 chapters. We're in Exodus chapter 7, 8, 9, and 10. Before I do, let me read you a little bit of the first plague so you get a feel of what's going on. Obviously, I'm not going to read all 4 chapters, but let me read a piece of the first one. We're going to read in chapter 7, beginning in verse 14. "The Lord said to Moses, 'Pharaoh's heart is hardened. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is going out to the water. Stand on the bank of the Nile to meet him, and take in your hand the staff that was turned into a serpent. And you shall say to him, "The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, says to you, let my people go, that they may serve me in the wilderness." But so far you have not obeyed. Thus says the Lord, by this you will know that I am the Lord. Behold, with the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water that is in the Nile, and it shall turn into blood. The fish in the Nile shall die, the Nile will stink, and the Egyptians will grow weary of drinking water from the Nile. And then down in verse 22, it says, after the water was turned into blood, the magicians of Egypt did the same by their secret arts. So Pharaoh's heart remained hardened, and he would not listen to them as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned and went into his house and did not take this to heart. That's the pattern that we see happen 9 times over in these chapters. Moses said, this is what's going to happen if you don't let the people go. Pharaoh said no, and this plague happened. Let me just give you a summary of all 9 of these plagues. The first one is the blood, the water turning into blood that we just read. Now, this isn't necessarily a literal thing. The ancient world talked about the moon turning to blood, and they knew that wasn't a literal thing. That means something made it turn red. We know that it's a lunar eclipse. They didn't know what that was, but they knew about blood moons. And so the water turning to blood doesn't have to be literal. It could be anything that turns it red. It could be minerals in the water, but it was obviously something poison because it killed the fish. So the water turned red, something in it that was poisonous. Number 2 is the frogs. The frogs. Something that Pharaoh's men were able to copy. What's interesting is Pharaoh couldn't get his magicians to undo the miracle. That's what he should have asked them to do. He couldn't get them to undo it, so he had to ask them to imitate it, and they did. But you know what? He had to go to Moses and say, now will you undo that plague for me? Because his magicians couldn't do that. One middle school teacher named Steve Callahan wrote, I had been teaching my 7th graders about World War II, and a test question was, what was the largest amphibious assault of all time? Expecting to see the D-Day invasion, I found one paper that said Moses and the Frogs. So, yeah, a major influx of frogs. And number 3 is gnats, or any sort of small bug. That word was also used for mosquitoes, which is the more likely interpretation, some sort of small bug that is a horrible pest. And they had those in mass. The magicians couldn't do that. And they realized this is the hand of a true God. And then number 4, the flies, a biting kind of fly that is found in Egypt. Number 5 is the death of the livestock. This is only the livestock that's in the field. Some people see a contradiction here when it says all of the livestock died, and then 2 plagues later, the livestock dies again. It clearly says the livestock that was in the field died of whatever this plague was. Number 6 is boils or skin ulcers or blisters that broke out on the Egyptian people. Number 7 was hail that fell with lightning and fire on the Egyptian people. By the way, it says heavy hail like had never been seen before. Twice it says like had never been seen before, had never been seen in Egypt. Heavy hail, we don't know if that means great big hailstones or if that means a whole lot of hail or some of both, we don't know. But a hailstorm like had never been seen before. And then the locust that came in mass and ate everything that was possibly left. Now, the hail probably happened in January because it says what plants were destroyed by the hail and what plants weren't because they weren't in bloom yet. And the experts say this would have been the month of January when that was the case. But the locust had to come 1 or 2 months later because more things were in bloom. Things had turned green again. There was stuff for the locust to eat, and they ate it all. And then finally, darkness. It says darkness so heavy it could be felt. They say total darkness can drive a person crazy. And they had total darkness for 3 days. Now, I know candles were invented before this. They had candles. I don't know if just the royalty had candles or the lay people didn't, or it happened to be a shortage of candles. I don't know, but it was a darkness that infected everybody, a darkness that could be felt. Now, those are the 9 plagues. There's an interesting pattern I'd never seen until I was reading it in the commentaries a couple weeks ago, and I just wanted to point it out real quickly. There's three groups of three. And in each case, in the first miracle, the first plague of those three, Moses meets Pharaoh as he's going out and tells Pharaoh what's going to happen. And then in the second group of each of those three, Moses goes into where Pharaoh is and tells him what's going to happen. And then in the third of those sets of three, Moses or Aaron simply make a gesture and the thing happens. They don't even tell Pharaoh, at least in the text, what's going to happen. And maybe that's one of those Hebrew things they use to make the text easier to remember and easier to group things together. But it's just an interesting pattern that I thought was an interesting sidelight. But there's a far more important question, a couple more important questions that we need to ask. And the first one is this: are these plagues real? Are these things real? There are scholars who claim this is a story that's been embellished over thousands of years. A few things went wrong, and the Israelites embellished the story over the years in order to make their God look bigger, in order to make their God look greater. But if we believe the Bible at all, we have to believe that these are things that really happened, that these were things that were devastating. Because the Bible refers back to these plagues, these 9, and then the 10th one, over and over throughout the entire history of the Bible. These things are looked at, and the Jewish people have celebrated these events ever since the day they happened. And there is reality to these. These are things that really happened. These are things that were absolutely devastating to Egypt. Now, there's a couple sidelights about that I want you to think about. And the one is, this is another reason to believe that Ramses II, in spite of all the popular shows and movies and everything else, Ramses II was not the pharaoh of the Exodus. I've pointed this out in terms of timing of this whole event. It actually happened about 200 years before Ramses II. If you read the timing in Kings and the timing in Judges, it adds up to that, and so on. So there's this popular idea that Ramses II, there was no, Egypt was very prosperous during the reign of Ramses II. And so this couldn't have happened then. It happened probably 200 years before. But this is another interesting thing that I've pointed out that has been fascinating to me, is this is another reason to believe the evidence, the new evidence I've pointed out that shows that Hebrew was the first written language. And Moses was one of the first people to actually utilize an alphabet and write things down. And it's fascinating to me when you see the history that God was preparing the alphabet and the people to write right at the time he was ready to give them his word. And so that's a fascinating thing. But the reason it's significant here is because the person that wrote these down was an eyewitness to the things that happened. He was an eyewitness. These weren't written thousands of years later. This was an eyewitness account of exactly the things that happened. Are these plagues real? They are real, and they were devastating. But the second question, and this comes up a lot, are these plagues simply natural phenomena? Are these plagues simply a natural phenomena? Everything that's written here in these 9 plagues are things that can happen naturally in the area of the Nile Basin. They all are. In this story, they happen to a significantly greater extent than we've ever witnessed them happening, but they're all things that can happen there. There's a groundbreaking study done in 1957 by a gal named Greta Hort. She wrote an article, a couple of different series of articles in some of the technical journals, and she argued that the right conditions would cause a chain of events, that these 9 things would follow one after another over a period of about 8 months. Okay, it was such an influential study that liberal scholars and even conservative scholars alike have kind of latched onto this to say, look, this really could have happened the way that it says it happened. Here's kind of the beginning of what happened. She proposes that there was a huge wet season, a huge flood sometime around August in the upper parts of the Nile River, and the red dirt that's up there, the Nile apparently turns red almost every August because of the red dirt in the upper regions of the Nile. And this would have happened in August, but this was a far worse year. And some reason this year there was bacteria in there that was a killing bacteria. Because of that, the fish died. Because the fish died, the frogs came out of the river. Because there were standing pools of water, there were more mosquitoes or gnats breeding. Because the frogs died and attracted flies, there was a plague of flies. And on this progression goes to try to explain all 9 of these events. Certainly, this sequence could possibly explain some of the process that God used. But the Bible expresses these things as the miraculous. These things were far greater in intensity than anything we've witnessed like it, even though similar things to this can happen. And what's interesting about that is that at least 6 of these 9 plagues, Moses went to Pharaoh and said, this is what's going to happen. Moses predicted it. He knew what was going to happen because God had told him. And beyond that, in many of these cases, God protected the Israelites from the events, from the plagues that were happening. If these were all natural events that just took place because of some flood and some long chain of events that happened in nature, Moses wouldn't have known what was happening. The Israelites would not have been protected. The Israelites were protected from, I think, at least 4 of them, possibly more. To say this is a chain of events that explain, or a natural chain of events that explains all of these plagues is, in my mind, to pick and choose which scriptures you want to read and to ignore the rest. And when you do that, you're totally undermining the entire authority of the scriptures. And so God may have used some natural process, but this is far beyond a natural process. These are miraculous things that God did. And he did them in order to tell people who he was so that the Egyptians would let the people go. Here's the big idea. There is only one true, all-powerful God. And he is working out his perfect plan. There's only one true, all-powerful God. And he is working out his perfect plan. He will use whatever means necessary to carry that plan to perfection. Whether it's natural causes or miraculous events, he will use those to bring about what he desires to bring about. Here's some thoughts I had related to that idea and to these plagues. I wrote 4 of them in your notes that I want you to think about today. Number 1, this one true, all-powerful God defeats the false gods. He defeats all of the false gods. There are some scholars who have proposed that each of these plagues is an attack on a particular Egyptian god. Now, the Egyptians depended on the Nile. It was their greatest resource, and so they worshipped it. The Egyptians worshipped frogs. They were considered a sacred animal. Those are the first 2 plagues. We know that cows were worshipped in ancient Egypt, and the 5th plague of the death of the livestock certainly was an attack on that. And Egyptians' highest god was the sun god Re. It occurred to me that that's funny in English, that the sun god's name is Re. Never thought of that until I wrote my notes this last week. Anyway, that's kind of interesting to me. But their highest god was the sun god Re, and the darkness was a direct attack on that god. As kind of a side note, it's interesting that Pharaoh's magicians were able to imitate the first 2 of the plagues, the frogs and the turning the water into blood. And some people have speculated whether or not they did that because it was sleight of hand or because they had some sort of true spiritual demonic power. Scholars debate that. I tend to think it's the second one because bringing frogs out of the dirt is a whole lot more than sleight of hand. And so I think they had some sort of spiritual power. And when they were challenged, they recognized that whatever Moses was talking to was a real spiritual power far beyond what they had. And they were the first to tell Pharaoh, hey, this is a real God. You better listen to what he has to say. He defeats the false gods. But the people that say every single one of these 9 plagues directly attacks a god of Egypt have to stretch sometimes to really make everything fit. So I'm not sure every single one was an attack directly on a god, but the overall effect was an attack on what the Egyptians thought their gods controlled. Commentator Douglas Stewart wrote this. He said, "These first 9 plagues were special, divinely produced manifestations of God's sovereignty over Egypt, over its king, over its people, over its environment, and over its gods. They were accomplished by imitations on a huge and destructive scale of phenomena thought by the Egyptians to be the province of their own gods. God turned things believed to be the specialty of the gods of Egypt against the Egyptians and showed himself in control of all the events and powers that they would have attributed to the objects of their faith." In other words, if each of these is not a direct attack on a specific god of Egypt, certainly the whole thing is a statement about what those gods control compared to what the all-powerful God controls. And they would have certainly seen that in that light. God defeats the false gods. Second, this all-powerful one true God wants us to know him. He wants us to know him. 8 times in these 4 chapters, it says, I want people to know. I want people to know. It says that to the Israelites, God's people. Now, you would expect God to say that to the Israelites, but what surprises me is when you count them up, he said that 1 time in these 4 chapters. These plagues are so that you will know that I am God. Also, it says the Egyptians would know. It says that 1 time. Chapter 7, verse 5. The Egyptians will know that I am Yahweh, that I am the God of the universe. So, who does he say it to most often? To Pharaoh. 5 times, God says to Pharaoh, I want you to know that I am God. I want you to know that I am Yahweh, the Lord. I think that's because of our first key thought, that God defeats all the false gods, and because Pharaoh viewed himself as God. And so the one true God reminded Pharaoh over and over and over, I want you to know who the true God is, and that is Yahweh. It is not you or any of your false gods. And then 1 time, God said all of these were done so that his name would be proclaimed in the entire earth. Not just the Israelites, not just the Egyptians, not just Pharaoh, but the entire earth. In a verse that's quoted in Romans chapter 9, it's 9:17 in Romans, it's 9:16 in Exodus. It says, just before the plague of the hail, God says, I could have put out my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, and you would have been cut off from the earth. But for this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth. You see, God did this so that he could be glorified as God over the whole earth. He wants us to know him. He wants us to know him as the all-powerful, all-knowing God. He wants us to know him as the God who gets glory over everything. And that's what he reminds us over and over in the midst of 8 times in these 9 plagues. God says, I want you to know. He wants us to know him. Jeremiah, God speaking through Jeremiah said, let not the wise man boast of his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast of his might. Let not the rich man boast of his riches. But let him who boasts boast of this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord. Through Hosea, God said, I don't delight in sacrifice. I delight in your loyalty. I don't delight in burnt offerings. I want you to know me. That's what God says. He is the all-powerful God, and he wants us to have a relationship with him. Number 3, we can have hard hearts. We can have hard hearts. 14 times it says that Pharaoh had a hard heart towards God. It would grow soft in the midst of some of these horrible plagues, but as soon as the plague was gone, it was hardened again, and that was the end of his soft heart. He had a hard heart towards God. Ravi Zacharias was a great Christian apologist of the last century. He passed away just a couple weeks ago. And Kathy was asking me about it. She said, I've seen a number of tributes to Ravi Zacharias. Do you know who he was? And I explained who he was, and then it occurred to me I'd never heard him speak other than little blips on YouTube, 5 or 10 minute blips. And so 2 weeks ago when I was exercising, I got out my computer and I turned on to find a couple sermons that Ravi Zacharias had given, and I listened to a couple of them over the next few days. And in one of those messages, he was telling a story about speaking at Princeton. And he was known as a great presenter of the gospel and the intellectual reasons for the gospel and so on. And so a number of professors got together and they said, let's send the hardest hitting philosophy professors and science professors we can to go and challenge him at the end of his talk. And so he's speaking at Princeton. He was warned that these professors were there, and he got to the end of his talk, and as he always did in colleges, he opened it up to questions, and he said, a few students asked questions. Not one professor asked anything. No one asked a thing. He kind of wondered what happened to the heavy hitters. Well, the next day, a professor from Princeton told him a story. He said, yesterday all these big philosophy professors were here that were supposed to put you to shame. And he said, yeah, I knew that. And he said, they didn't ask any questions. And Ravi said, yeah, what happened? And the guy said, well, I was talking to one of them. I asked them how come they didn't ask any questions. And their response was, his argument was so well put together, our questions wouldn't have mattered. And the professor said, well, did he convince you? And the professor said, no. Think about that for a minute. Ravi Zacharias' response was, no amount of evidence would convince them, because admitting a God puts a personal responsibility on them which they don't want. At the very beginning of his speech, here's what Ravi Zacharias said. I'm here to convince you there are no intellectual hurdles to Christianity. The hurdle is in your own heart. That's what he began his talk with. And he proved that was true with these professors. They had hard hearts. We can too. And we have to be cautious of that. Here's one sign of a hard heart. Compromise with God is a sign of hardness. Now, you wonder why I say that. I'm stepping on my toes, so don't feel too bad. Pharaoh keeps offering compromise solutions to Moses. Why don't you just take a few days off and worship your God here? Why don't you take the men only and go out in the wilderness and worship your God? Why don't you take your families and leave your livestock here and go out and worship your God? All the way through, Pharaoh kept offering these compromise solutions, and God kept saying no. I have to watch my own heart, because that's where my mind is all the time. Constantly saying, I'll go this far, I'll go this far. But God, I don't know about that last step. And I think that's a danger that many of us in Christianity face. Someone teasingly said, what would happen if 99% were good enough? You would have no phone service for a random 14 minutes every day. Your refrigerator would quit working 3.5 days every year. There would be 3 misspelled words on every page of type. There would be 3 billion emails lost every day around the world. 3 billion. I had to look that up. I couldn't believe it. And yeah, there are an average 300 billion emails sent every day. 3 billion of those would be lost. 40 million drug prescriptions would be wrong every year. That's dangerous. And 1.3 million babies would be lost every year. Now, that's kind of a silly way to think about it, but we can't compromise when it comes to God. He wants us all. And that compromise is a sign of what's in our hearts. Second subpoint, we can have hard hearts, but even if we do, in spite of us, God is glorified anyway. God brings about His perfect will in spite of us, in spite of our sin, in spite of our hard hearts. He still accomplishes His purpose. In chapter 3 at the burning bush, God told Moses that Pharaoh would say no and he would have to multiply his signs. He said it again in chapter 4, verse 21. He said it in chapter 6, verse 1. In chapter 6, verse 6. In chapter 7, verses 3 to 5. All of those before the plagues even came. God told Moses, this is what's going to happen. Pharaoh is going to say no until I multiply my signs. Listen, to chapter 7, verse 3. I will harden Pharaoh's heart. This is before it all started. I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and though I multiply my signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, Pharaoh will not listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring my hosts, my people, and the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment, and the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord. God told Moses numerous times before this happened exactly what was going to happen. Pharaoh is going to have a hard heart over and over again until I multiply my judgments. Well, that brings up a third question as a subpoint of this. Who hardened Pharaoh's heart? Who hardened Pharaoh's heart? 14 times in these chapters it says Pharaoh had a hard heart. 6 times it simply says his heart was hardened, or it remained hardened, or it was hard. 3 times it says Pharaoh hardened his own heart. That's only 9. In the other 5, it says the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. It not only says it 5 times in these chapters, it says it in chapter 4, it says it twice in chapter 11, and it says it again later in chapter 14. The Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. God did it so he could get the greater glory, which he can do because he is a sovereign God and he is in control. And so he hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, if you're not comfortable with that, maybe here's a way to think of it. But I'm not sure I totally buy this, but maybe it'll help you. Think about a dish of ice cream and a fresh dinner roll. And you put them out in the sun on one of our 90-degree days we've been having. What happens to those? One becomes soft and the other becomes hard. It's not the sun, it's the substance of the food. And so if you struggle with the idea that God can harden someone's heart, part of it might be the substance of the heart that's being hardened. The good news is that in spite of that, God knows what it takes to soften a hard heart. Remember Ravi Zacharias' comment, no amount of evidence would convince them. It takes a change of heart. And God knows exactly how much it takes to soften a hard heart. And that brings up point number 4. There is grace for those who trust in God. God softens our hearts to the point where we can trust in him. And we must turn to him and experience that grace. God often made a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. He specifically says so in the plague of the flies and the hail and the death of the livestock and the darkness. Those had no impact on Israel at all. Probably some of the others, the same thing. But you know, God even had mercy on some of the Egyptians that would listen. Listen to chapter 9, verse 20. This is just before the plague of the hail. Moses said, the hail's coming. He said, send and get your livestock and all that you have in the field into a safe shelter. For every man and beast that is in the field and is not brought home will die when the hail falls on him. And so whoever feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh hurried his slaves and his livestock into their houses. But whoever did not pay attention to the word of the Lord left his slaves and his livestock in the field. You see, God even offered grace to the Egyptians who would believe in what he said. God offers grace in the midst of these troubles. God is in the process of fulfilling his purpose. He is the all-powerful, one true God of the universe. You might ask, you know, with all the stuff we're facing today and some of the troubles that are in our culture today, does this connect with that? And I've kind of given that some thought over the last few days since we got back on vacation. And what I have to say is this, that God brings about perfect justice in his time. But sometimes we have hard hearts. And sometimes we exercise injustice in the midst of our world. But God has a gracious way of bringing out his people. God has a gracious way of softening the hearts of those who practice injustice. God has a way of bringing about perfect justice in his time and in his way. And I think those are things we can trust in the midst of everything that's happening in our world today. Ultimately, God is the one true God who is in charge, and he will bring about his perfect purpose. He will use whatever natural means, whatever miraculous means is necessary. That's the God that we worship. That's the God we turn to because he is a God of grace.